Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Kang. He is finally a playable character, and the question on everyone's mind is the character good, and is he worth building? The answer isn't necessarily clear-cut. He definitely isn't bad, but it really depends on the game modes that you focus. In my opinion, if you play Alliance Conquest and value that game mode at all, then he is 100% worth building. He has a debuff leadership, which is very important for that mode, and the character is actually pretty good in an auto 3 vs 3 format. However, outside that game mode, it's a little bit tougher to find value in the character. In things like timeline, there are plenty other characters that are better than him and other ones that are basically on par with him, so you might not necessarily even need to build him. It really depends on the ban list, but for the most part you just have a ton of other options, so it's difficult to find value for him in timeline specifically. Surprisingly enough, the character could potentially be considered meta in the Otherworld mode, but honestly it's hard to recommend him for that because the ban list changes so often that he could just become useless for that mode in many of the weeks afterwards. So it's really kind of weird to recommend the character, but I'll let the testing kind of give you an idea so you can decide whether he will be valuable for your account or not. If you want my general opinion on the character, I believe that he falls somewhere around Gore or Doom's level of performance in PvP and is well ahead of them in PvE. I really think that if the devs did at least one pass over on Kang's kit and just tweaked and buffed some minor things, that he could potentially be amazing in PvP, but I'll discuss some of those potential changes closer to the end of the video once you see how the character initially functions. Before I go into the testing, I just wanted to share how much it costs for me to build up the character. I didn't really want to show the build up process because I think that that's probably boring for most people, but as you can see here, I initially started with around 405 million gold, and then after building up the character I was left with 225 million gold roughly, which is around 185 million for me to build him up close to absolutely max. For most players it won't really cost this much. It should probably be somewhere in the 100 million gold range to build him to level 70. So with that cost, I was able to get the character to rank 1. I have an absolutely maxed out build. The only thing I'm missing is his actual artifact, but in place of that I'm using a maxed out level 6 artifact that has the cruelty instinct tag and bonus damage to villain types or pure evil types actually. You can see my character stats in this screenshot. The damage is a little bit lower than it should be because I'm not using him in the leadership position, which you're pretty much always going to be doing, and you're going to get that extra 55% attack increase. The ISO8 set that I went with is Hawk's Eye, and I purely chose that just to fill out his stats because I needed some cooldown, some dodge because he doesn't have a uniform to put more dodge on, and because I prefer the attack increase from the proc rather than the defensive or heal that you get from some of the other ISO8 sets. Besides that, the character has Odins in every slot, and the CTP that I'm using is a brilliant CTP of Authority because it synergizes very well with the high base mitigation that he has in his kit. So you can essentially just cap out the mitigation with a steel authority, especially if you have it brilliant like I do. On the PvE side, I did the standard stage 9 null test without using his leadership or supports, and the character was able to clear the fight fairly quickly. He did so in about 1 minute and 30 seconds, which means that the character isn't just purely a PvP unit, he can function in PvE as well. To emphasize that point, I took him into a stage 35 of null, again without using his leadership or supports, and even though I did end up dying at the end and there was basically no time left, the character can definitely complete this stage. Just for reference, after Gore got buffed, I tested him on stage 35 with a leadership and supports, and the character wasn't actually able to complete the first phase in that 2-minute window to be able to even complete this fight, whereas Kang can already do that without the additional help. If you don't really care about PvP and just want to use the character in PvE, the most ideal build for him will likely be a CTP of Rage. However, the character is proc friendly for the most part, so I think that you can definitely make something like a CTP of Energy or even a CTP of Destruction work. Though keep in mind that he does have native penetration, so you won't really get much value out of the penetration on a CTP of Destruction. The character is relatively easy to play and is fairly tanky. You have a lot of that mitigation, you can just stay in iframes, you can move around with the V-pad skill, and you can constantly spam the heal off his second skill. The fact that his leadership also gives you an attack increase and a debuff cleanse means that you can't really get locked down either. You can see in this clip that by adding that leadership with the supports, the character is easily able to clear stage 39 with over a minute left, even without having a damage proc. I don't think the character will have any presence in ABX or ABL, specifically because Jean exists and she eclipses everyone, and soon enough Loki will probably make a pretty big splash in this game mode too. But if you do want to use him in ABX or ABL for whatever reason, he does have pretty much all of the cancel effects with the exclusion of Fracture. And when I tested him, I was able to score close to 9 million with him. So if you do end up using something like a Rage on him, I'm pretty sure you can get somewhere around 11 or 12 million with him. In terms of the rotation to use for the character, you can do a quick cancel of the first and second skill to fill up the ultimate faster, but for the most part, the main rotation will be to do a 3 slight delay cancel by about a half second when you just see the animation start, and then you do a 5 cancel 4. The fourth skill is essentially the skill that you want to proc on. When you have access to your ultimate skill, you can do a 3 delay cancel 6, cancel 5, cancel 4. If you're using a CTP of Rage, you can also do a slight delay cancel of the first skill before you go into the fourth skill, which should add another layer of damage onto the rotation. As you can see from this clip, even at level 70, without a damage proc, the character is able to solo Dormammu, something that Gore, I believe, wasn't able to do. So he, again, is already better than Gore on the PvE side at the very least. Even though the PvE review will likely be interesting for some, I'm pretty sure that most people just really want to know how the character performs in PvP at a high level. Generally speaking, the character is definitely good for PvP. He has all of the core mechanics that you would want from a meta character, including a revive, native penetration that is up to 50%, super guard break on his second and his fourth skill, a bunch of iframes including a full iframe on the fifth skill, an iframe ignore on the second skill, and to a limited degree some healing on the second skill, but because it has a low cooldown, he can use it more frequently than most other characters can that also have healing. To add to that, the character also has that coveted self-debuff leadership and an attack increase, but unfortunately that only applies to him. He also has time freezing in his kit, which is a rare skill effect that not many characters have. Thankfully, even though the character's cooldown on the second skill is very low, the AI does prioritize other skills in his kit, which means that he does have a general rotation. Usually the AI opens with the second skill, which has the iframe ignore and counter, and then goes into the fifth skill, which is quite nice because it's a full iframe and has a damage over time effect that can continue even after he dies. And then the AI generally goes back into the second skill, and if that is on cooldown or interrupted, will go into the fourth skill, which also has super guard break and can lock down the opponent while the fifth skill is raining down on them, and the damage from the fourth skill and other skills are also applying. Sadly, the AI doesn't really use the third skill, so you don't benefit from the damage accumulation often, but the character's AI rotation is already pretty good with the 2, 5, and 4, so it doesn't really matter either way. From the many timeline tests that I did, and from these clips, you can see that Kang was able to take out opponents like Jean, Gore, Thanos, Hulk, Sentry, and even one life of Adam Warlock. Unfortunately, he wasn't really able to take out both lives of Adam Warlock because he ends up dodging the second skill that Kang does, and for the most part, Adam opens with his own second skill, which usually just one-shots the character. Spider-Man is another character that he has trouble versus because Spider-Man has that damage increase versus villain types and has those quick iframes to basically wipe him out before he can actually do his counter iframe ignore skill. Similarly, Wolverine is also an issue because he opens with his iframe ignore skill that has that super guard break and can interrupt Kang's own counter iframe ignore skill and end up just locking him down and killing him. So with these three examples, you can kind of see what the main issue is with Kang, and that is that if the character can't land his counter iframe ignore skill, then he's basically just left to sit there while the opponent either goes into their own iframes or interrupts his counter with super guard break. This leads me into the build recommendation, which for the most part is just going to be a Steel Authority, whether it's a mighty or a brilliant one. The Steel Authority synergizes very well with his base mitigation of 40%, meaning that if you have a mighty one and a support, or just a brilliant one that goes to 60%, then you can basically cap out the mitigation for that 5-second duration and just take no damage. On top of that, the Steel Authority also provides him with super guard break immunity, which means that your second skill will be much more consistent because you won't be knocked out of it, and he can actually do the counter and iframe ignore part of it. When the steel proc is down and you do get your second skill interrupted, he's mostly just going to be standing around because he doesn't have an iframe ignore skill active, so you want that invincible, and you're also going to benefit from the damage accumulation that fills it up to max, so that once you do have your second skill, he's going to be dealing a lot of damage with it. Alternatively, you could go with a CTP of regen, since he does spam the second skill a lot and it has the healing on it. With the regen and the health and recovery that you get from it, it would essentially bump up the 15% to about 30%, meaning that you'd heal for about a third of your health every time that it's activated. However, I don't really see this overtaking a Steel Authority, since it's very difficult to compete with that 5 seconds of immortality that you basically get from it. Similarly, you could also go with a CTP of Greed if you want to go with the proc or offensive option, but again, I don't see this being as good as the Steel Authority because you're basically just sitting around at the beginning of the fight, not making much use of the proc, and because the character can basically get one shot if the second skill doesn't connect after that. Generally speaking, you want to use Greed on characters that have fast opening skills, so that would be ones like Jean with the second skill, Adam Warlock with the second skill, and Wolverine with the fifth skill. You can clearly see from these clips that the character isn't outright broken and isn't just downright horrible in PvP. He's good for the most part and can handle most metas, with the exception of some really high fast hitting ones like I mentioned before, Adam Warlock, Wolverine, and Spider-Man. For some people this might be a little bit disappointing since it won't really give them much value in timeline or really much use to build the character overall, and honestly for that reason I think that the devs should really consider doing a pass over on the character's kit or adding some minor buffs. In my opinion, they only really need to change one thing to make the character a top contender in PvP, and possibly 2 other minor tweaks to make him very powerful. The most essential change that they can make to the character is to add an iframe ignore buff to the second skill. Oftentimes, the second skill will get interrupted, which will leave the character just sitting there and end up dying. If you're playing on manual, you're also stuck not being able to do anything while the opponent goes into their own iframes, and by the time you have the second skill off cooldown again, you won't really have a chance to use it, or the opponent will have basically just depleted all of your life. By having that iframe ignore buff on the second skill, similar to what Adam Warlock has, once the character uses the second skill, if it gets interrupted for whatever reason, you can easily go into any of your other skills because they are temporarily also iframe ignore skills. I think that this one change would actually place the character as meta in timeline, because the main issue he has now is that you basically just have to stand around hoping that you are able to counter the opponent to hit them if they go in their iframe. If they do go in their iframe and you don't counter them, you're just stuck sitting there waiting to be able to hit them, and oftentimes that leads to your death. Aside from this, if they really wanted to buff the character, then they can add native super guard break immunity similar to what Gore has. This would make his second skill much more consistent since he would never really be knocked out of it. On top of that, they could buff his healing from 15% to at least 25% or even 30%, or even consider adding another 20% heal to his fifth skill. 15% is honestly just too low even with a short cooldown. Many other characters have short cooldowns on their heal skills, and those are at least 30%, and they can also spam them often too. For those who are wondering how the character performs on manual and timeline, I also did 2 tests of that, and these fights will also emphasize how much of a difference the buffs I mentioned would make to the character overall and actually push him to be meta in his current state. The general rotation that you want to use for the character is to open with the 5th skill and immediately cancel that into the 4th skill. If you can't use the 4th skill because the opponent is an iframe, then you immediately want to go into the 2nd skill, which will probably knock them out of their iframe because of the counter portion and burst them down from the 5th skill raining down afterwards. Usually just by doing the 5th and 4th skill, you can lock down the opponent and deal a mass amount of damage, since the 5th skill will just be constantly raining down on them, and the 4th skill allows you to move the character around and lock them down from the super guard break that it does. The main issue with the character really lies in that 2nd skill, and is the reason why I don't think he is necessarily meta in timeline compared to someone like Gore that can just constantly spam their iframe ignore skill. And it's because once you use the 2nd skill and it doesn't connect with the counter, you're basically just stuck there and you can't take out the opponent. You can see that prime example versus Adam Warlock, where I really can't do anything to be able to hit him besides hoping that that 2nd skill connects. If they added that iframe ignore buff that I mentioned though, you don't have to rely on the 2nd skill connecting, and you could easily just go into your other skills to take out the opponent before they do the same to you. With timeline aside though, the character does provide a good amount of value in other PvP modes. Specifically in this season for Otherworld, he is pretty valuable, and you can see in this test that I did, the character didn't even end up dying once, and I was able to basically just ace this fight with him. In a 3 vs 3 auto format, he does provide you with a good amount of value, since he frequently spams that 2nd skill that has the super guard break to lock down the opponents, then often does the 5th skill that just covers the map, and then goes into the 4th skill to also cover the map and lock down the opponents even further with super guard break. Unfortunately, in Alliance Conquest, I actually haven't been able to get into a fight with Kang, so I haven't been able to record any footage of him. But fortunately, one of my Alliance members, Buttons, was able to record a clip with him with Kang at level 60. I believe he has a Mighty or a Brilliant Authority on the character, and was able to take out a T4 gene with him. So clearly the character is valuable for Alliance Conquest at the very least, and in the second fight he basically got demolished because one of the other weaknesses that Kang has is that he is very susceptible to reflect damage. Because he opens with the 2nd skill and it itself is not an iframe skill, that means that any damage he deals with that skill is basically able to be reflected back to him. I was actually just able to record a clip while I was doing this video, so you can see from this one that he is clearly at least on par with Dr. Doom. He doesn't die once, and he's able to take out both lives of Dr. Doom and take out a magic with the Immortal Artifact, even though I'm not really using any proper supports for the character. So my recommendation for the character is that if you play Alliance Conquest, then definitely build up the character. If you play Timeline, then you don't really need to build up the character. He's basically just going to be a backup if the ban list changes where you really need a debuff character and they just take out most of the other options that you have. And then for Otherworld, it's pretty much the same thing as Timeline. It's difficult to kind of make a recommendation for that mode since the ban list and all the different buffs and stuff that occur changes pretty drastically on a weekly basis. My basic overall opinion of the character is that I do think that he does need a minor change or a buff, since everyone should be excited to build up a native tier 3 character, considering that they are so expensive. It shouldn't just be restricted to a certain set of players or just one game mode where the character is something to be celebrated. And that also ties into the other thing that I wanted to say, is that native tier 3 characters really should be able to bring a new mechanic to the game every time they come out, because it's one of the rare things that you get every so often. Previously, native tier 2 and native tier 3 characters always brought something fresh and exciting to the game. For example, Jean had the revive, Thanos had the remove all buffs, not just active ones. Then you had characters like Sentry that introduced super guard break, I believe, or at least showed it on the skills and just had it pretty much on every skill. Then you had characters like Mephisto that could change stances or forms. You had characters like Null that had the immortality effect that was brought into the game. Molecule Man that had a unique leadership that no one else has. And even Gore has the hidden ability of having super guard break immunity in his kit. So pretty much all of these native characters brought something new and something kind of unique to the game that most other characters don't have, or that they did in a very unique way. But Kang doesn't really do that and didn't really bring anything unique or new to the game in any way, which is really unfortunate because native characters should be the ones that introduce a new interesting mechanic to the game or bring something new to it. I know that this will probably fall on deaf ears, but if the devs really wanted to make the character interesting, then they should tweak his leadership, since it's unnecessarily not really that good in general. It does provide him a good amount of basic attack, but is pretty much just a debuff to everyone else. So one of the things that they could do is maybe have the debuff leadership there, but when you get debuffed, you also have the effect where he increases all buffs by 50%. That would actually make it a pretty interesting leadership, since you can use it in PvE as well, and it would bump up all of the effects that he has in his kit, including the healing, which is low, as well as the penetration and other things, but it would also work for other characters too. That is my ranty review of Kang. He's actually pretty good for the first iteration, but I just don't know if they're actually going to iterate and change any things or buff him in any way. If you're not really intrigued or interested by this character's performance, there is somewhat of a silver lining in that the character is tied into the MCU, at least for the next big major phases, unless they've changed that. So there is a chance that the character gets a huge improvement with a potential T4 in the future, which would be pretty insane for a native tier 3 character and the stat bump that he would get. Anyways, that is the review for the character, and if you found the video interesting or helpful, then please consider liking and subscribing, possibly sharing it with others. Again, it helps them out and it also helps me out. And as always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these videos, so thank you, but the video is now over.